Let me ask you something. Before this month, have you ever heard of a country called Cape Verde? Be honest, if you're like millions of people around the world, your answer is probably no. And yet, in just a matter of days, everyone suddenly started talking about it. Football fans couldn't stop mentioning it. Social media was full of videos about it. People were asking, where is Cape Verde? How are they this good? How is such a small country competing with football giants? Let me tell you, football isn't actually the most interesting thing about Cape Verde. Long before the world discovered their football team, this tiny country already had one of the most unbelievable stories you'll ever hear. Imagine a country so small that many cities around the world have more people than the entire nation. Imagine a country made up of tiny islands floating alone in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Imagine a country that hundreds of years ago didn't even have a single person living there. No villages, no cities, no roads, just empty volcanic islands surrounded by endless ocean. Now ask yourself, how does a place with no people become a country? How does a country with almost no natural resources survive? How does a nation where most citizens live outside the country than inside it still manage to build an identity so strong that the whole world suddenly starts paying attention? And maybe the biggest question of all is, how did this tiny African nation become one of the biggest stories in world football? Trust me, this isn't really about football. Football is just the reason everyone finally noticed. The real story began more than 500 years ago when a group of Portuguese sailors sailing across the Atlantic stumbled upon a chain of islands that looked completely empty. They had no idea they were about to change history forever. And today, those same forgotten islands have become one of the most talked about countries in the world. So why is everyone talking about Cape Verde? Well, to answer that, we first have to find it. Because believe it or not, most people looking at a world map today still can't. If you want more videos that explain the stories behind the world's biggest event, don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments which historical events we should uncover next. Let's do a little experiment. Imagine you are standing on the coast of Senegal in West Africa. Now look out into the Atlantic Ocean. Keep looking for about 600 kilometers. Eventually, you will come across 10 small volcanic islands scattered across the ocean. That's Cape Verde, or as the country officially calls itself today, Cape Verde. And yes, those tiny islands are an entire country. When people hear the word island, they usually imagine one piece of land, maybe like Madagascar or Sri Lanka. But Cape Verde isn't one island. It's actually an archipelago, which simply means a group of islands. Out of the 10 main islands, 9 are inhabited. Each one has its own personality. Some are dry and rocky, some are mountainous, others are famous for their beautiful beaches and crystal clear water. It's almost like 10 different worlds all belonging to one country. The capital city is Praia, located on the island of Santiago. If you walk through Praia today, you'd find busy markets, schools, government buildings, football pitches filled with children, music playing from cafes, and people living ordinary lives. In other words, it doesn't feel like some forgotten island in the middle of nowhere. It feels like home. Cape Verde has a population of only about 600,000 people. That's smaller than many cities around the world. In fact, there are neighborhoods in Lagos, London, and New York with populations that aren't too far off. An entire country with fewer people than many single cities, yet somehow the whole world is suddenly talking about them. Cape Verde doesn't share a land border with any country. There's no neighboring nation, there are no highways connecting it to another capital. It's just ocean. Every direction you look, there's water. And for centuries, that isolation shaped almost every part of Cape Verde's history, including its economy, its culture, and even its football. But don't mistake isolation for weakness, because sometimes being isolated forces people to become incredibly resilient. The people of Cape Verde learned how to survive with limited resources. They learned how to depend on one another. And perhaps most importantly, they learned how to look beyond their own shores. For many Cape Verdeans, the biggest dream wasn't just building a life on the islands, it was living them. Today, there are actually more people of Cape Verdean descent living outside Cape Verde than inside it. Imagine a country where your chances of meeting one of its citizens are actually higher in Portugal or the United States than in the country itself. Wait, let me explain. If you go to Portugal or the US, the chances of meeting a Cape Verdean is higher than if you go to Cape Verde. Do you understand now? So how did that happen? Why did so many people leave? Was life on these beautiful islands really that difficult? Now let's go back to the 15th century. Europe was in what historians call the age of exploration. Countries like Portugal and Spain were obsessed with discovering new lands. Why? because back then the world wasn't fully mapped. There were no satellites, no GPS, no Google Maps. So sailors relied on the stars, the wind, and a lot of courage. Every voyage into the Atlantic Ocean felt like stepping into the unknown. Some ships disappeared forever, others returned with stories that sounded impossible. One of the countries leading these expeditions was Portugal. At the time, Portugal was becoming one of the greatest maritime powers on earth. Its sailors were exploring the coast of Africa, searching for new trade routes, especially a sea route to India. Among the famous explorers was Prince Henry the Navigator. Despite his nickname, Henry wasn't actually sailing the ships himself. Instead, he sponsored expeditions, trained navigators, and encouraged Portuguese sailors to keep pushing further south along Africa's coastline. Without him, many historians believe Portugal's age of discovery would have happened much more slowly. Then around 1456, Portuguese explorers sailing through the Atlantic came across something unexpected. They came across a chain of volcanic islands which was completely empty. There were no smoke from villages, no fishermen, and no signs of human life, just untouched land. Imagine being one of those sailors. After weeks at sea, you suddenly spot a land that no one appears to own. It must have felt like discovering another world. The Portuguese quickly realized these islands could become incredibly valuable, not because they were rich in gold or because they had giant forests, but because of where they were located. Cape Verde sat almost perfectly between Europe, Africa, and later the Americas. In other words, it was the ideal stopping point for ships crossing the Atlantic. It served as a place to rest, repair ships, collect fresh supplies, and continue the journey. Sometimes location is more valuable than natural resources, and that's exactly what Cape Verde had. By the 1460s, Portugal began settling the islands. The first permanent settlement was established on Santiago Island. For the first time in history, people finally called Cape Verde home. So while settlers arrived from Portugal, they weren't the only people brought to the islands. Thousands of Africans were forcibly taken from the mainland as slaves. Cape Verde soon became one of the major hubs in the transatlantic slave trade. Ships carrying enslaved Africans stopped on the islands before continuing across the Atlantic. It's one of the darkest chapters in the country's history. Families were separated, lives were stolen, and somehow Cape Verde became deeply connected to one of humanity's greatest tragedies. Over time, Portuguese settlers, African communities, and later people from different parts of the world began living together. Cultures mixed, languages mixed, traditions mixed, and out of that mixture, a completely new identity was born. Today, most Cape Verdeans speak Portuguese officially, but in everyday life, many speak Cape Verdean Creole, a language shaped by both Portuguese and West African influences.
Oi, Johnny. Modi que bosta. Leva esse manga fresculi.
Maria, não está bom? Esta parte melhor. Não tá levando quilo?
Even the country's music, its food, and its traditions reflect this incredible blend of cultures. Cape Verde isn't purely European, neither is it purely African. It is proudly both, but life on these islands was never easy. The land was dry, rain was unpredictable, there were very few natural resources, and over the centuries, many people began asking themselves if they could really build a future here. For thousands of Cape Verdeans, the answer became maybe somewhere else, and that decision would change the country forever. Because in the next chapter of this story, Cape Verde didn't just lose people, it created one of the largest diasporas in Africa, a nation where incredibly more citizens would eventually live abroad than at home. You see, Cape Verde is located in a part of the Atlantic that is naturally very dry. Unlike many other African countries, it doesn't have huge rivers flowing across the land. It doesn't have endless forests, and it doesn't receive reliable rainfall every year. Some years, the rains barely come at all, and when the rain doesn't come, nothing grows, crops fail, animals die, food becomes scarce, and suddenly survival becomes the biggest challenge. Throughout its history, Cape Verde experienced several devastating droughts. Some lasted for years, and during the 18th and 19th centuries, these droughts became so severe that entire communities struggled to survive. Then we had the famine. One of the worst periods happened in the 1940s. Thousands of Cape Verdeans lost their lives because food simply wasn't available, all because the sky refused to produce rain. It's one of the saddest chapters in the country's history, yet very few people outside Cape Verde even know it happened. So people started making one of the hardest decisions anyone can make. They left, not because they stopped loving their country, but because they wanted a chance to survive. Some moved to Portugal, others settled in the United States, especially in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Many also moved to the Netherlands, France, Luxembourg, and other parts of Europe. Slowly, Cape Verdeans built communities all over the world. Today, It's estimated that there are more people of Cape Verdean descent living abroad than living in Cape Verde itself. Imagine if more Nigerians lived outside Nigeria than inside it. It sounds impossible, but for Cape Verde, that's reality. Their people are everywhere, yet no matter where they go, they still proudly call themselves Cape Verdean. One thing that kept them connected was music. If you've ever listened to Cape Verdean music, you'll notice it's emotional, almost nostalgic. One of the country's most famous singers was Cesaria Evora. People called her the barefoot diva. She often performed without shoes as a way of remembering the poor people she grew up with. Her songs weren't just music, they told stories of longing, stories of leaving home, stories of hoping to return one day. For many Cape Verdeans living overseas, her voice reminded them of the islands they had left behind. Another thing that connected them was football. No matter whether they lived in Lisbon, Paris, Rotterdam or Boston, football became something that united Cape Verdeans everywhere. Children of Cape Verdean families grew up playing in some of Europe's best football academies. Some became professionals, some represented clubs in Portugal, others played in France, the Netherlands, Belgium and beyond. And little by little, a dream started to form. What if all these talented players, instead of representing other countries, came together to represent Cape Verde? At first it sounded impossible. How could such a tiny country compete with football giants? How could a nation with just around 600,000 people stand on the same pitch as countries with tens of millions? But sometimes football isn't about population, it's about passion, and Cape Verde had plenty of that. The world just hadn't noticed it yet, because everything was about to change. Not overnight, but through years of hard work, until one day, the entire football world was forced to ask one question: who exactly is Cape Verde? Where exactly is Cabo Verde? So after everything Cape Verde had been through, including the drought, the famine, and the people leaving their homeland in search of a better life, you'd think the story would end there, a small country doing its best to survive. But sometimes history has a funny way of rewarding people who refuse to give up. And for Cape Verde, that reward came in the form of a football. When most countries build a national football team, they mostly choose players who grew up in that country. Cape Verde didn't have that luxury. Remember, for decades, thousands of Cape Verdeans had immigrated to Europe and America. Their children were born in places like Portugal, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, and even the United States. They grew up playing on better pitches with better coaches and in some of the best football academies in the world. Many of them became professional footballers, but deep inside, they never forgot where their families came from. So you're born in Portugal, you speak Portuguese, you play football in Europe, but every holiday, your parents tell you stories about a small group of islands in the Atlantic Ocean. They cook Cape Verdean food, they play Cape Verdean music. They remind you to never forget where you came from. Eventually, the Football Federation of Cape Verde started reaching out to these players, not with money or with fame, but with one simple message telling them to come home and help build something special, and many of them did. At first, the rest of Africa didn't pay much attention. Cape Verde wasn't considered a football powerhouse. It had never won the African Cup of Nations. They weren't qualifying for every major tournament. In fact, there was a time when simply getting a draw against a big African nation was considered a success. But behind the scenes, something was changing. Year after year, the team became stronger. The chemistry improved. Players who had grown up in different countries started playing like they'd been together their whole lives. They weren't just representing a football team anymore. They were representing an entire nation, both at home and across the world. Then came 2013, a year many Cape Verdeans will never forget. For the very first time, Cape Verde qualified for the Africa Cup of Nations. Now, if you are from a football giant like Nigeria, Brazil, or Germany, qualifying for a tournament might not seem like a big deal. But for Cape Verde, this was history. An entire nation celebrated. People filled the streets. Children who had grown up dreaming of moments like this finally saw their country on Africa's biggest football stage. And they didn't just show up, they competed. They reached the quarterfinals. Suddenly, people started asking who these guys were. That tournament changed everything. For the first time, Cape Verde wasn't just another small island nation. They had become a team that nobody wanted to underestimate. Over the following year, they continued improving. They climbed the FIFA rankings, qualified for more major competitions, and slowly built a reputation for playing fearless football. Not because they had the biggest stars, but because they played as one. Then we have another big moment that changed everything again. The 2026 FIFA World Cup. For years, qualifying had seemed almost impossible. Think about the countries they had to compete against. Some had populations of over 100 million people. Some had leagues worth billions of dollars. Some had football history stretching back more than a century. Cape Verde, a country of around 600,000 people, 10 small islands, very limited resources, yet somehow they made it. Against all odds, they reached football's biggest stage. And they didn't go there just to make up the numbers. They played with courage, with confidence and with belief. Fans around the world watched this tiny African nation stand toe-to-toe with some of football's biggest names. People who had never heard of Cape Verde suddenly became supporters overnight. Social media exploded. Searches for "Where is Cape Verde" skyrocketed. Travel videos about the country went viral. Football had done something politics, history and geography had never managed to do. It made millions of people curious about Cape Verde. The beautiful part is that football didn't create Cape Verde's story. It simply introduced that story to the rest of the world, and that's why today everyone is talking about Cape Verde. You know how the internet works now. Every single day, millions of stories happen around the world, but we only pay attention to a few. Sometimes all it takes is one moment, one event, one viral clip, or one football match, and suddenly an entire country becomes the center of attention. That's exactly what happened to Cape Verde. During the 2026 FIFA World Cup, people weren't just watching football anymore, they were watching a story. Imagine supporting a country with millions of people, billions of dollars invested in football, world-famous players, state-of-the-art stadiums, and decades of success. Then imagine seeing them struggle against a tiny island nation that many people couldn't even locate on a map. That's the kind of story people love, because humans naturally support the underdog. Social media made it even bigger. People started posting videos asking, "Where is Cape Verde? How can such a small country be this good? I've never even heard of this place before." Travel creators started making documentaries. Geography channels started explaining where the islands are. Football fans began researching the players. Even people who had never watched African football before were suddenly interested. Within days, millions of people who had gone their entire lives without hearing the words Cape Verde were seeing them every day. Do you know what I find fascinating? Football wasn't the only thing people discovered. As they searched for Cape Verde, they also discovered its music, its beaches, its mountains, its volcanoes, its food, its culture, its history. They discovered that this wasn't just another football team. It was an entire nation with an incredible story. A story that had been hiding in plain sight for hundreds of years. Tourism experts even noticed something interesting. Whenever a small country performs well on the world stage, people become curious. They start searching for flights, hotels, travel videos. They want to experience the place for themselves. We've seen it happen before, and Cape Verde is no exception. A football tournament can sometimes do more for a country's global image than years of advertising. That's the power of sports. But perhaps the biggest winners aren't the tourists. They are the children growing up in Cape Verde today. Imagine being a 10-year-old boy or girl kicking a football around one of these islands. A few years ago, you might have dreamed of playing for Portugal or another big football nation. Today, you can dream of wearing the Cape Verde shirt, because now the whole world knows who you are. And sometimes belief is the most powerful thing you can give the next generation. You know, there's a saying that goes, "It's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog." I think that perfectly describes Cape Verde. On paper, they shouldn't be competing with football giants. They don't have the biggest population, they don't have the richest football league, they don't have endless resources, but what they do have is heart, resilience, and a history that taught them never to give up. So why is everyone talking about Cape Verde? Is it because of football? Yes, but only partly. People are talking about Cape Verde because football introduced the world to a country that has been quietly writing an incredible story for over 500 years. A story of survival, a story of identity, a story of resilience, and a story that proves sometimes the smallest countries leave the biggest impression. What happens when the World Cup is over? What happens when the cameras leave? What happens when the headlines stop? Will the world remember Cape Verde, or will this tiny island nation once again become one of the world's best kept secrets? Let's talk about that. Now let's be honest, when the World Cup is over, the cameras will move on and people will start talking about another country. That's just how the world works. But I don't think Cape Verde will go back to being forgotten. There's another lesson here, and I think it's one we can all learn from. We live in a world that often tells us that you have to be big to matter. Big population, big economy, big army, big football league, big influence. Cape Verde proves something completely different. Sometimes you don't need to be the biggest, you just need to make the world pay attention. And when your moment comes, you have to be ready. Cape Verde was ready. As Africans, I think there's something inspiring about the story, because for years, many people only heard negative stories about African countries, conflict, poverty, disasters, but this story is different. This is a story about resilience, about identity, about a small African nation showing the world what determination looks like. Whether Whether you're from Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, or anywhere else, there's something to admire about that. So the next time someone mentions Cape Verde, don't just think about football. Think about the empty islands discovered over 500 years ago. Think about the people who built a nation from nothing. Think about the families who crossed oceans in search of a better life. Think about the children who grew up dreaming on tiny islands surrounded by the Atlantic. That's the real story, and maybe that's why everyone is talking about Cape Verde. It reminds us that incredible stories can come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes all it takes is one moment for the entire world to finally notice.